Good evening. I am going to be reposting a post that was put out originally by Brian Entin, and then it was reposted again by another source, and I'm trying to find that now. I just lost it, so bear with me. Jeez, I'm losing my mind here. I'm sorry. I had it up and now it's gone. Okay, originally this post was from Brian Entin. It was reposted by Briefly Criminal, and now I am going to repost it because I find it interesting. It's regarding a file that was given to Brian Entin. I had never heard of this before. I do not have any verification of its being accurate except for the fact that it's a repost from Brian Entin himself, so it's kind of interesting. So I'm letting you know right now that this live stream includes authorized restream content from the original broadcaster. It is used with permission, and it is for entertainment purposes only. It is not a factual, verified reporting from any type of law enforcement agencies. So I wanted to make that clear before I did this repost. And again, it's regarding some information about Guthrie, and it's interesting, if nothing else. So you might want to listen to it and share some thoughts on it with me. I'd be interested to see what you think. So thank you, everybody, and I will talk to you later. PI 56 is out.
That, once Brian understood what he was looking at, changed the entire shape of this case. Because here is what nobody knew. In the weeks before Nancy Guthrie vanished, Annie Guthrie was not living a normal life. She wasn't grieving a sister in slow motion. She wasn't waiting by the phone. She wasn't going through the ordinary, heartbreaking motions of a family member trying to hold it together while an investigation moved at its own pace. Annie Guthrie had become obsessed. Quietly. Privately. Hidden from the people around her. Hidden from investigators. Hidden from everyone who thought they knew what she was doing and how she was spending her time. She had been researching something specific. Something that consumed weeks of her life in the period directly before Nancy disappeared. Something that required late nights and library visits and deleted search histories and a handwritten notebook she kept separate from everything else. The people closest to her had no idea. The investigators working Nancy's case had no idea. Brian Entin had no idea, until a source walked him through what was on Annie's devices, what was in her notebook, what she had been quietly assembling while the world around her assumed she was simply a grieving family member waiting for answers. She wasn't waiting for answers. She was building toward one. And once investigators found what Annie had been researching, the entire timeline suddenly looked different. Before you can understand why this discovery matters, you need to understand who Annie Guthrie was. Not in her own mind, not in the investigation files, but in the perception of every single person who knew her. Because perception is the thing that makes this story so difficult to process. Annie was not a complicated figure publicly. She did not attract a controversy. She did not have a history of erratic behavior or suspicious associations, or a reputation that made people watch her carefully. She was the opposite of all of those things. People who knew Annie Guthrie described her with a consistency that becomes almost striking when you line the descriptions up next to each other. Steady, private, dependable, the person who showed up without being asked, the person who handled the things nobody else thought to handle, the person who absorbed difficulty without making a display of it. Her relationship with Nancy was the defining relationship of her life, close in the way that some family relationships become close. Not just blood, but chosen. Years of shared history. The kind of bond that gets stronger under pressure rather than fracturing. When Nancy disappeared, Annie was one of the first people investigators spoke to. She was cooperative from the first conversation. Forthcoming. She provided contact information, timeline details, background on Nancy's relationships and habits and routines. She did everything right. She showed up to the search efforts. She spoke to journalists when it was helpful, and declined when it wasn't. She maintained a composed, cooperative presence through weeks of an investigation that was producing no answers. Everybody saw the same thing. Nobody looked closer. Because there was no reason to look closer. Annie Guthrie was the grieving family member who was handling it with unusual grace. That was the story. That was what everyone saw. But behind that story, behind the composed cooperation and the steady presence, and the quiet dependability, Annie had started digging into something nobody knew about. Not after Nancy vanished. Before. The digital review that surfaced all of this was not initially focused on Annie. That's important to understand. She was not a suspect. She was not a person of interest. The review of her devices was part of a broader process. Investigators going through the phones and computers of people close to Nancy, looking for context, looking for any digital thread that might point somewhere useful. It was supposed to be routine. The first thing that caught the attention of whoever was doing the review was the activity timestamps. Normal device usage has a rhythm. It follows the shape of a human day. Mornings, evenings, scattered use in between. When you look at weeks of activity logs, a pattern emerges that reflects the life of the person using the device. Annie's pattern was wrong. The concentration of activity was in the overnight hours. Not occasionally, consistently. Night after night, across a period of several weeks, Annie's devices showed sustained, focused use in a window that most people spend unconscious. That kind of pattern can mean a lot of things. Insomnia, a night shift schedule, grief-driven sleeplessness. But then investigators looked at what the activity actually was. The volume of searches was the first flag, not the casual, unfocused searching of someone unable to sleep and drifting through the internet. Structured searching. Sequential. The kind of search pattern that indicates someone working through a prepared list of queries rather than following instinct. Someone with a methodology. Then the deletions. Targeted. Specific. Large sections of Annie's browsing history had been manually removed, not through an automatic clearing, but through deliberate, selective erasure. Entire date ranges gone. Specific sessions removed, while others remained intact. You delete selectively when you know what you're removing. When you understand what the specific thing reveals about you and you want it gone, but you're willing to leave everything else. Annie had been cleaning her digital trail. Not completely, which is part of why investigators were able to reconstruct as much as they did, but carefully enough that it was clear she understood she was leaving one. The phone records compounded it. Calls at unusual hours. Numbers that didn't match her known contacts. One number in particular, prepaid, no registered owner, that she had called multiple times over a 2-week period. Short calls, under 3 minutes each. The kind of calls that accomplish a specific exchange of information rather than a conversation. Someone she was calling who wasn't in her phone. Someone she didn't want in her phone. Then the library. 4 visits over 3 weeks, confirmed through records and footage. Annie had not been to that library in years before this period. The visits weren't browsing. She was requesting specific materials. Public records, archived newspaper editions, court document collections, materials you request when you know what you're looking for, and you need a paper trail that doesn't run through your home internet connection. She was using the library specifically because it was less traceable. And the notebook, found during a search of Annie's residence, not hidden, sitting in a desk drawer, which is almost more concerning than if it had been hidden, because it suggests she thought it was ordinary enough not to require concealment, or she had simply run out of time to move it. Handwritten, dense, pages of dates and names and locations and abbreviations, connected by arrows and question marks and circled entries. Whatever Annie had been doing, she had been doing it long enough and seriously enough to fill a notebook. Investigators were no longer looking at a grieving family member. They were looking at someone who had been running a parallel investigation. Here is what she was actually researching. And this is where the story shifts from strange to something that investigators are still fully working to understand. The first thread, property records. Annie had been pulling ownership documentation on a specific cluster of properties. Remote parcels, rural land, the kind of properties that don't attract attention because there's nothing obviously notable about them. No commercial activity, no community significance, just land registered in names and held quietly. But Annie hadn't pulled these records randomly. She had pulled them in a sequence that indicated she was following a chain. One property owner connecting to another. One transaction pointing toward the next. She was tracing something through the ownership records. A pattern, a network. Something that the individual records obscured, but the sequence revealed. Investigators cross-referenced the names she had flagged. What they found required a second look. But this wasn't even the strangest thing investigators noticed. The second thread was older than anyone expected. Annie had been pulling newspaper archives going back years. Not coverage of Nancy's case, older material, from a period well before any of this began. She wasn't documenting the present investigation. She was looking into something historical, something that had happened before, in a form that connected, at least in Annie's reconstruction, to what was happening now. The specific additions she requested told investigators something about what she was looking for. She wasn't browsing, she was pulling particular stories from particular dates, which means she already knew, going in, what those dates were significant for. She had gone to the archives to confirm something she already suspected. The third thread, GPS coordinates. A document recovered from Annie's devices, one that the deletion process had missed, contained a list of coordinates, formatted in a way that suggested they had been transcribed from another source, rather than generated independently. Investigators ran every coordinate on the list. They were locations, remote, off-road, the kind of places that don't appear in ordinary navigation. Several of them overlapped with the properties from the ownership records Annie had pulled. Others corresponded to locations that had surfaced, briefly, without resolution, in the early stages of the investigation into Nancy's disappearance. Annie had been mapping something before Nancy vanished, and the map she was building overlapped with the geography of Nancy's case in ways that should not have been possible if the two things were unconnected. But this wasn't even the strangest thing investigators noticed. The fourth thread, a name. A name in the notebook, not Nancy's, not anyone immediately obvious in the investigation. A name that appeared repeatedly, circled, underlined, returning across multiple entries on multiple dates. Investigators ran it. The name connected to one of the property ownership chains Annie had been tracing. It connected to one of the archive dates. It connected to the financial records. It was a thread running through everything Annie had assembled. A name at the center of a web that Annie had been quietly, methodically mapping for weeks. The fifth thread, financial records, public court filings, financial disclosures from litigation, bankruptcy records, the administrative paper trail that accumulates through legal proceedings and becomes technically available to anyone who knows how to find it, which most people don't. Annie knew how to find it. She had pulled filings connected to the name, printed them, annotated the printed copies in her own handwriting, notes in the margins, lines drawn between figures, amounts circled. She had been following money, and the money she had been following led somewhere. But this wasn't even the strangest thing investigators noticed. The strangest thing was the satellite images. 11 of them, printed at high resolution from publicly available mapping tools, annotated by hand, structures marked, access routes traced, areas of apparent ground disturbance circled. Annie had been conducting remote surveillance on specific locations, from her kitchen table, using tools anyone can access, building an overhead picture of places that connected to the coordinates, the properties, the name, the money. She had been assembling all of it, the archives, the records, the coordinates, the financial filings, the satellite images, into a single, coherent picture of something. Something she had not shared with anyone, something she had not brought to investigators, something she had kept entirely to herself, in a notebook in a desk drawer, until investigators found it and realized they were looking at weeks of parallel work by a woman everyone had assumed was simply waiting. When investigators laid Annie's research chronologically against the timeline of the weeks before Nancy disappeared, the sequence that emerged reframed everything. Monday, 3 weeks before Nancy vanished. Annie begins pulling property records. The first ownership chain she traces corresponds to a parcel 40 miles outside the search zones investigators would later establish. She cross-references the owner's name against court filings. The name appears in a financial dispute involving a company that dissolved years earlier. She writes the name in the notebook for the first time. Tuesday, library visit. Annie requests archived newspaper editions. The dates she pulls correspond to a local story that received limited coverage years before. A story that had, in the public record, no apparent connection to Nancy or to Annie or to anything in their lives. But Annie had known to look for it, which means someone had told her it was there, or she had already found a thread that led her to it. Wednesday, the GPS coordinates document is created. File metadata places its creation in the early morning hours, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Annie had been awake through the night compiling coordinates she had gathered from sources investigators are still working to identify. She now had a list. She had something to map. Thursday, the satellite images are printed, all 11. Annie had spent the morning pulling overhead views of the coordinate locations, printing them at her home, annotating each one by hand. By mid-afternoon, her phone places her driving in the direction of one of the mapped areas. She didn't stop at the location, or at least there is no record of her stopping, but she drove toward it. Friday, the financial filings. Hours on public court databases. Pages printed. The money trail she was following connected the property owner to a second name, a name that had not appeared in the notebook before this date. It appeared that evening. 2 names now, circled, connected by a line. Saturday, a phone call, the prepaid number, 90 seconds. Annie made no notes in the notebook on Saturday. Whatever that call contained, she kept it in her head. The following Monday, Annie's device activity drops to near zero. No searches, no file activity, no library visits. A silence that lasted 3 days. And on Thursday, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The research Annie had been conducting for 3 weeks, the web she had been quietly assembling, the coordinates and names and properties and money, all of it was complete before Nancy vanished. Which creates a question that investigators have not been able to answer cleanly. Did Annie know what was coming? Did her research lead her to a conclusion she didn't know how to act on in time? Or had her research, somehow, set something in motion? Pull back from the broad strokes for a moment, because there are individual details in this case that feel small in isolation and become something else entirely when you put them next to each other. The receipt. Found in Annie's car during evidence collection. A gas purchase. Dated to the Thursday of the week before Nancy vanished. The same day Annie had driven in the direction of one of the mapped coordinate locations. The gas station was 50 minutes from Annie's home, in the precise direction of the location she had satellite imaged. She had driven there and come back. There is no record of what she saw, no notes in the notebook corresponding to that date, just a gas receipt from a station on a road that leads somewhere she had been studying from above. The notebook page, page 19. Unlike the surrounding pages, which were densely written, page 19 had 4 words and a time, a date, an address, a time, and 1 word beneath it that investigators have not publicly disclosed. The date on page 19 was the Thursday Nancy disappeared. The time was early morning. The address was not one that had appeared anywhere else in Annie's research. Investigators went to that address. Brian Entin confirmed through a source that what they found there was significant enough to generate a separate investigative thread. What that thread contains has not been made public. The unexplained call. 11 days before Nancy disappeared, Annie called a number that wasn't in her contacts. Not the prepaid number, a different number. Registered to a business that had been dissolved 2 years earlier. But the call connected. 1 minute and 40 seconds. Investigators contacted every person associated with that dissolved business. Nobody acknowledged the call. The deleted email. Forensic recovery pulled a fragment of an email Annie had sent and deleted within the same session. The recipient address was partially recoverable. The domain fragment that investigators retrieved corresponded to an entity connected to the financial records Annie had been pulling. She had reached out directly to someone inside the web she was mapping. The content of the email remains unrecovered. The storage unit. This came late in the investigation. A facility not close to Annie's home, registered in a name that took time to connect to her. When investigators gained access, they found a secondary archive, printed documents, a second notebook, earlier than the one found at her home, covering a period that preceded everything else by months. Annie had been researching this longer than anyone realized, and she had been storing the evidence of it off-site. The only reason you keep a backup in a separate location is because you're worried about losing the primary copy. Annie had been worried about something. Brian Entin has been on the ground with this for weeks. Not following the official narrative, working beside it, around it, through sources who will say things off the record that the investigation won't confirm publicly. Here is what those conversations produced. A former neighbor of Annie's, someone who had lived next door for years before relocating, told Brian that in the months before Nancy disappeared, Annie's patterns had shifted in ways that were noticeable but unexplainable at the time. Lights on late. A car sometimes absent in the early morning and back before most people were awake. Less conversation over the fence. A quality of distraction that the neighbor had chalked up to stress. Looking back at it now, the neighbor told Brian it looked less like stress and more like preoccupation. The kind of distraction that comes from having a problem you're actively working on rather than one you're passively carrying. Brian spoke to a local official with direct knowledge of the investigation, someone he's not identifying by role. That person told him that the storage unit discovery had changed the internal assessment of the timeline. The earlier notebook indicated that whatever Annie had been investigating, it had started not weeks before Nancy disappeared, but months before there was anything to investigate, before Nancy vanished. Which means Annie had not started researching in response to the disappearance. She had been researching before it. A friend of Annie's, someone she had known for years, who asked not to be named, told Brian that in the months before Nancy vanished, Annie had asked an unusual question in conversation. She hadn't framed it as urgent. She had dropped it casually, almost in passing. She had asked, if you knew something was wrong but you didn't have proof, what would you do with that? The friend hadn't thought much of it at the time. It had sounded like an abstract question, a hypothetical. It wasn't. Brian also spoke to a researcher familiar with the kinds of public records Annie had been pulling, someone with professional experience in document research. That person told Brian that the sequence of records Annie had accessed indicated a sophisticated methodology. She wasn't fumbling through unfamiliar databases. She was moving through them efficiently, pulling specific documents, cross-referencing in a way that suggested either prior experience or someone guiding her. The question that raises, who, if anyone, was guiding Annie's research, does not yet have an answer. The online communities that follow this case have been working through this since the first details became public, and the theories they have produced cover a range that tells you something about how genuinely unresolved the central questions are. On Reddit, the most discussed theory centers on the second name in Annie's notebook, the name that appeared after the financial filings. The argument, built across multiple threads with contributions from dozens of users, is that the two names Annie had circled represent two sides of a transaction. Not a property transaction, a relationship. One person who was visible, and one person who was operating through the first as a buffer. Annie, in this theory, had found the buffer and was working toward the person behind it. Whether she got there before Nancy disappeared is the question the thread cannot answer. On Facebook, the discussion has taken a different direction. A group focused on the case has been pulling public records independently, attempting to replicate Annie's research using the limited information that has been made public about what she was looking at. They have identified what they believe is the property cluster Annie was tracing, and have posted overhead images with markings that, they argue, show the area was more actively used than the official record acknowledges. Investigators have not commented on the Facebook group's findings. YouTube analysts covering the case have focused heavily on the storage unit revelation. Several videos have noted that the earlier notebook, covering months before Nancy disappeared, suggests Annie had information that no one else in the investigation had at that stage. The most watched video on this specific detail argues that the question isn't what Annie was researching, it's who told her to start. The local rumor circuit has produced something different from all of these. A claim, unverified, not connected to any named source, that Annie had been seen meeting with someone in the weeks before Nancy vanished. Someone not from the area. Someone whose connection to Annie has never been established publicly. Brian Entin has not confirmed this claim. He has also not dismissed it. The online communities are debating four primary theories at the moment. Annie discovered something about Nancy's life that Nancy herself didn't fully understand, and the research was an attempt to protect her. Annie discovered something about a third party connected to Nancy, someone whose involvement in events predated the disappearance and whose presence in Nancy's life represented a threat Annie had identified. Annie was operating with information given to her by someone inside the official investigation, a source who couldn't surface what they knew through official channels and used Annie as a cutout. Annie's research and Nancy's disappearance are coincidentally adjacent, connected in subject matter but not in causation, with Annie having been investigating something historical that happened to overlap with whatever took Nancy. None of these theories have been confirmed. None have been definitively ruled out, and the online communities will keep pulling threads until something resolves. Here is where Brian Entin's reporting takes a turn that nobody was expecting. Because the working assumption, the assumption that had shaped how investigators and the public and the online communities were thinking about Annie's research, was that Annie had been investigating someone. A person. Possibly someone connected to Nancy. Possibly someone in Nancy's orbit, whose presence she had identified as threatening. the notebook, the financial records, the names. All of it seemed to point toward a person, or persons, at the center of whatever Annie had been building toward. That assumption was wrong. Or at least, it was incomplete in a way that changes everything. A source close to the investigation walked Brian through a detail from the earlier notebook, the one found in the storage unit, the one that predated everything by months. The entries in the early sections of that notebook were not focused on a person, they were focused on a location. Specifically, a location that had a documented history, a location connected to events that had occurred years before Nancy disappeared, events that had been investigated at the time and closed without resolution. A location that had, in the intervening years, passed through multiple ownership changes in a pattern that Annie had apparently identified as deliberate concealment rather than ordinary property movement. Annie had not started with a person. She had started with a place that something had happened at, a place that someone had subsequently worked to make difficult to find, difficult to access, difficult to connect to what had happened there, and what that place connected to, the historical events, the ownership chain, the deliberate concealment, was not directly about Nancy. It was about someone connected to Nancy, someone from years earlier, from a chapter of the story that predated the current investigation entirely. Someone whose connection to Nancy was real, but had never been examined, because nobody had known to look for it. Annie had found it. She had traced it. She had documented it. She had built a picture of a connection between Nancy's present and something that had happened at that location in the past. A connection that, if Annie's reconstruction was correct, explained things about Nancy's disappearance that the official investigation had not been able to account for. Annie had not been investigating who took Nancy. She had been investigating why someone would want to. And the answer she had been moving toward, the answer buried in the property records and the archives and the financial filings and the satellite images, was historical. It existed before Nancy disappeared. It existed before anyone knew there was a case to investigate. Brian Entin is still working to confirm the full scope of what the location represents and how it connects to the current investigation. What he can confirm is that the internal assessment of Annie's research shifted significantly once investigators understood that the location, not the person, was the starting point of everything she had been building. The person was the end point. The location was where it began. 2 days ago, Brian Entin received a document. He is not disclosing the source. He is not disclosing the channel through which it arrived. What he has said publicly is that the document came from outside the official investigation, and that its contents have been verified against known facts of the case through multiple independent checks. The document is a single page. On that page are 4 things. A name, not a name that has appeared publicly in connection with this case. Not one of the names from Annie's notebook that investigators have been working through. A name that, when Brian ran it, did not immediately connect to anything in the known record of this investigation. But it connected to the location from Annie's research, the place with the history, the place that had changed ownership through the pattern Annie had identified as concealment. The name on the document had a connection to that location that predated everything. That went back further than the events Annie had traced. An address. The same address from page 19 of Annie's notebook. The page with the date of Nancy's disappearance, and the time, and the single word investigators have not disclosed. The address that investigators visited and generated a separate thread from. That same address is on the document Brian received. A date. Not a past date. A date that has not yet arrived at the time Brian received this document. A date that falls within the next investigative window. A date that suggests whoever sent this document believes something is going to happen, or needs to happen, by a specific point. And a photograph. Brian has not described the photograph in detail. He has said it shows a location. He has said the location is one that will be recognizable to people who have been closely following this case. He has said that when he saw it, he understood why Annie Guthrie had spent weeks researching in secret. He has said that when he saw it, he understood why she had been afraid to bring what she knew to the people around her. He has not said what it means. He has not said where the investigation goes from here. Because Brian Entin, who has been working this story longer than almost anyone, is not sure yet. What he is sure of is this. Annie Guthrie found something real. She built something real. She spent weeks documenting a connection between Nancy's world and a history that predated all of this. A history that someone had worked very hard to bury. Whether the document Brian received is the missing piece that ties that history to what happened to Nancy, or whether it is one more layer of a mystery that keeps opening inward, is something investigators still haven't answered. But they're closer than they were, and so are we.